a question for you guys. I've been reading this book. The question is, if you had a hunch that there was a plague, when would you start telling people? Because if you start telling people too early, you're going to be accused of hysteria. Markets will start panicking, people start losing their minds. We know what happened to toilet rolls during COVID times. But on the flip side, if you tell people too late, then you've given the disease enough time to spread invisibly. People still be commuting, planning their holidays, debating whether it really is that serious. And so, because that's the thing about catastrophes like the plague, by the time you've reached certainty, by the time the stats have risen to a point where it can no longer be socially ignored, the damage would have already been done. The window for easy intervention would have closed. That ship would have already sailed. So the question is when? When do you start telling people? One of the biggest illusions, in my opinion, of modern life, modern society, is that it's created this illusion that we are beyond collapse. Like things like mass deaths, famine, pandemics, all of that stuff belong in the distant past. Like think medieval paintings, history documentaries quietly being narrated by a British gentleman, violins playing in the background, like in the distant past. Whereas in reality, there's a very thin line between ordinary life and suffering, catastrophe, pandemics. Like people still be going to work, the sun will still be shining, trains will still be running. All of that will be happening while the disease is spreading quietly, with authorities or people in general debating the semantics or the terminology, like do we call it a plague, do we not? Processing the terminology over the emotional vulnerability of society at large. During this book, Camus shows how the plague is existential, because modern life, like I said, has us believing that we are beyond collapse. It's given us this illusion that modern life is stable. We have our Wi-Fi, we have our antibiotics, we have our coffee shops, an iced vanilla latte. Like we are disconnected from how biologically fragile we are. And it probably has something to do with the way history has been taught to us through the lens of wars and when said wars happened and where, and rather than also shedding light onto biological events. Because it could just be me, but there was a page where Camus lists the different plagues that have happened in the past. And it stopped me in my tracks and it had me thinking, like, why is it that the only one that I'm familiar with, barely, is the bubonic plague / the Black Death in the 1300s? Like all the others, I was unaware of. And it probably has, like I said, something to do with the fact that modern life has us disconnected from how biologically fragile we are. And talking about said biological fragility, like entire areas of medicine, whether it's organ transplant, chemotherapy, intensive care, surgery, they all rely on, quietly depend on antibiotics continuing to work. We know microbes are continuing to evolve because unfortunately they don't get the memo that, well, humanity has already declared victory. So microbes are continuing to evolve. We know there's growing antimicrobial resistance. I don't really know at what rate and what kinds of new antibiotics are being produced. Then we also know that there's advances in biotechnology. And so all of these different factors, amongst others, means that the risk of biological catastrophe continues to loom over us and isn't exactly something confined to history books or nature. And I don't really know if the right word is threat, but it continues to loom over us given the potential for human recklessness or systems failing us or human ambition, etc., etc. On a side note, because I know Camus describing the build-up to people acknowledging that there is a plague, what unsettled me was the psychology behind certain characters like Dr. Rio. Like I know Camus was describing Dr. Rio's thought process, his perspective, rather than endorsing outright. But there's a line, I'm going to insert it here, where Dr. Rio basically says, or he thinks, that someone like Joseph Grant was put in this world in order to carry out the unobtrusive but indispensable role. And like I said, like I know Camus was just highlighting how Dr. Rio thinks, but I don't know, there's something unsettling to know that, like, I know greed exists, I know people like to just hoard as much as they can for themselves, but to think that some individuals genuinely believe that some people's existence is purely to fulfill a social function while they themselves get to occupy a more meaningful role, there's something deeply, inherently unsettling about that. I know I'm continuing to fly off on a tangent, but like I said, greed, I can compute. The I want it all for myself, I don't want to share, that I can compute. But to think that some people inherently believe in some sort of human hierarchy, that they don't innately believe that all humans are equal, irrespective of wealth, status, appearance, occupation, etc., that is deeply disturbing. And circling back to that moral dilemma of a question that I asked at the start, if you were holding a position of authority in society and you have this gut feeling that you may have something like the plague on your hands, when would you start telling the public? Because if you start telling them too early, because like I said, you don't have that certainty, but you have a gut feeling. If you tell them too early on, you're going to be accused of fear-mongering, for social fragmentation, stigma, people will be panicking, Marcus will be panicking, and if it turns out not to be a plague, you're going to be bearing the brunt of all of that. But if on the flip end, it turns out to be the plague and you've stayed silent for too long, because even silence is a decision itself, but you've stayed silent, then that means you're responsible for X amount of people dying while life ordinarily continues, because you have opted for preserving social calmness. And so, like I said, even silence is a decision when you have that gut feeling. And that's the hard thing about being in a position of leadership. When you have that gut feeling and you don't have all the information that you'd like to be working with, you have to make a decision with that uncertainty, because reality, or catastrophe like a plague in this instance, isn't going to be waiting around for everyone to get comfortable, to feel certain about what decisions they want to make before it announces itself. I probably should have led with this at the start. I'm only a quarter of the way through the book, guys, so please, for those of you who have read the book, do not spoil it for me. I just thought I'd share my thoughts as I was reading along, as I was going through the book. With that being said, let me know what your thoughts and ideas are in the comment section. And as always, I'm looking forward to what you guys have to say.